Anthony, you were on
Hey,
the line. What would you like to talk about today?
yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to apologize for my phone's bad audio. I know it has bad audio, and it's just I don't know what to do about it. So hopefully we can work around that. I
We'll
told
do our
the
best.
call screener. Yeah, I told the call screener I wanted to talk about neuroscience and materialistic explanations of the mind, but really I wanted to do more was kind of play off of Jenny's call, because when she was first asking you, Shannon, about why you deconverted, one of the reasons you listed was you were studying psychology and neuroscience. But
That wasn't a reason.
really,
That was just that was contextual. But yeah, that
yeah, it
was the
was. I mean, it
context
was
of the
one of
circumstance.
many things you mentioned. But I guess I really wanted to talk more generally about everything you were saying about and all the reasons you gave. And we can go into that. We can go into the neuroscience, but really, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about the Christianity too. First of all, when you say if Christianity is false,
Hmm.
the religion you were raised in, you said that you were raised a Christian and Anglican, and you started
Hmm.
investigating it, and you found all these problems, and
Hmm.
let's just say it's valid. Some of them are, so I'm not going to
Say
argue
it.
that. But
Okay.
if everything was falsified, every 100% of it, that's still not a reason to become an atheist. I mean, I feel like atheists make this logical fallacy, have this logical problem when they say, okay, the religion has been falsified, therefore there is no God. Do you kind of see the problem with that?
I see the problem with it generally, but I've reconciled myself with that problem. When I deconverted from Christianity, I didn't immediately become an atheist. I do what most of us did. And I was like, define myself as spiritual, and I looked at Buddhism, and I did all the stuff that deconstructors do. And I'm sure this is ringing true to a lot of people who deconstructed. It was a process that took years and years and years. And I didn't just be like, okay, well, Christianity is not true. That means there's nothing. I wasn't ready to do that just yet. What finally put me to the point that I would say that I was a hard atheist would be that I don't think that there's a viable definition of God that doesn't have so many internal inconsistencies that it renders itself to be nonsense, or is so general and generic that it's useless and doesn't actually impact me at all, even if it were true, and none of it is falsifiable or could be tested. So whatever looks like evidence for most of it is actually just some sort of like anecdotal emotional investment into desiring to believe. So that's what led me to be an atheist. I don't think that there is anything like a God that is feasible, and whatever definitions don't have those internal inconsistencies that render them nonsense are just so innocuous that they're functionally useless. And any type of God like that would not want or desire or even be capable of desiring a personal relationship with anybody. So it just wouldn't matter. And you couldn't prove it anyway. So that's what led me to be an atheist. It wasn't just, I'm not Christian, therefore I'm an atheist now. Although that is fair. Some people do that because, and whatever, that's their journey, but that wasn't mine. You're imbuing
Okay,
that
well,
upon me because that story was very like
no,
that. I couldn't sum up 10 years of my life in a 5-minute YouTube snippet to answer somebody's question that was just sprung upon me in real time.
oh, that's fair. That's fair. But it is what you said. So that is, and I do know that, or it does seem to
What
me
is what
like
I
a lot
said?
of
That
when
did I
Jenny
say
asked
I was
you,
no longer a Christian, therefore I was immediately an atheist?
that was your answer to Jenny when she asked you why you became an atheist. You immediately went into the problems you started seeing with Christianity. And I think, okay,
Yeah, because I was currently
Christianity's
a
false.
Christian, so that's part of the journey.
And the
Okay, so that
question
was the
asked by
start.
Ginny was, how did you become a Christian? Or how did you become an
Right.
atheist? Obviously, the
Right.
first and most significant step on that, which took up the thrust of the answer, was, well, how did I stop being the biggest block to
Religion I
being an
was.
atheist, being a Christian?
Yeah, which is fair. I mean, I guess like we're going around in circles. It's a nuanced point. If you didn't hear the final little step to my, no longer believing that any God exists at all or is plausible, it could be a product of the fact that that conversation went down about 700 different rabbit holes almost immediately after, and I didn't feel like it was beneficial to incorporate it. But I am telling you now, so you can
Okay.
take that for what it's worth.
That's very fair, and I
Yeah.
just wanted to put that out there because a lot of atheists, make what they do is they constantly focus on the problems with Christianity, and they say, "Oh, look, there's problems in the Bible. They can't prove this or that. Therefore, there's no God." And I see that being done constantly, and it kind of sounds to me like that's kind of what you were doing, but you weren't. You were just couldn't say everything in a short period of time. But the reason I wanted to start there is because it is something that it's a trick that atheists play to
well, what atheists do, what other atheists do is inconsequential to me. You're having a conversation with Will and I, so I don't really care what other atheists do.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Are these atheists in the room with us right now? Like, what are they telling you? Like, first of all, I don't know any atheists like that, like except for like Reddit trolls. But that's also inconsequential. Like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
We wouldn't agree with that argument.
A lot of people use Reddit.
And if every atheist but me had all the worst reasons, that still wouldn't change my position.
And it's also certainly not what I did, because I was never a Christian, right? I don't actually care about Christianity. If I was going to be religious, I'd be Muslim. I've said this on like a huge number of occasions.
Oh, that's interesting. Or that. Sorry, go ahead, Anthony.
That's a really strange thing to say. But all right, well, let's go into Christianity then, because Shannon, a lot of the things you were saying about it, the criticisms, I think are based on misrepresentations of Christianity that have admittedly come from Christians themselves in many cases. And I think one of them is the inerrancy.
You think the synoptic problem is a misrepresentation that comes from Christians?
Well, it's not exactly that specific point, but a lot of what happens is, okay, Christians say the Bible is this perfect book that was essentially like written by God through human authors. And
I never thought that. I was an Anglican.
Anglicans don't hold to an.
I mean, you're assuming I had a position I didn't have. I was an Anglican. Like, for example, like I always believed in evolution. It blew my mind when I found out that, and I believed in deep time. Like when I deconverted or deconstructed and discovered the internet, I was like, whoa, people think the earth is 6,000 years old. People think that every word in the Bible is like completely, whoa. I was raised in a tradition that allowed for subjectivity. So if you're addressing me, I don't think that you fully understand where I was coming from to begin with.
And I was raised by a bunch of ex-Christian hippies, so
that sounds awesome.
The Anglican Church would say that there's different ways to interpret the Bible, but I'm sure they wouldn't say that there's actual errors in the Bible, would they?
They probably wouldn't say. They would say that the Bible was God's word, but it was written through the hand of humans, like inspired humans. And therefore, if there are some errors and inconsistencies, then that's just because of, the fact that he was doing it through people, and people are fallible.
The Anglicans quite famously thought there was one major error. That's why they left.
Yeah, that's right.
Obviously, they think there are errors.
Yeah, Henry thought that he was committing adultery because he slept with his brother's wife, and that he should be able to get a dispensation. From Catherine of Aragon, from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and therefore he split from the church. Anyway, I know that stuff, but okay, sorry, I'll let you get your point, Anthony. Sorry, somebody said something about Anglican history, and I got excited.
Yeah, well, in any case, I think that part of the problem is that this idea that has been put forward by Christianity for a very long time traditionally, that the Bible is inerrant, is actually a misrepresentation that allows, skeptics to attack a straw man that never should have been that way. So I think that the people who wrote the Bible, the books within the Bible, even in the Old Testament and the New Testament, didn't really think that they were just recording events as they were, and they were. Even in the Gospel of Luke, it says, he was looking around, he found all these different sources, and then that's the testimony he's giving. He didn't say, like, this is a perfect transcript of everything Jesus said, and I know this for a fact because I'm an eyewitness. He just said, this is the sources I have, this is what I know at this point, and then
said he was writing an orderly
around.
account, and most people think he was a companion of Paul.
So yeah, well, maybe, but so when you go to like the number of people at the tomb,
you're talking to me like I don't know the Bible.
No, you do. I'm not saying you don't. I'm just saying like when Luke's sources he probably looked at a source that said, there are this many people at the tomb, and it differed from whatever sources that Matthew and Mark and John were using. But
right,
and
so you don't think any of them were eyewitness accounts then? You don't think any of the Gospels were eyewitness accounts?
No, actually, Matthew.
You said they were using sources. You don't use sources for your own eyewitness testimony, right? Like if you're asking me if I witnessed a car accident and you say, "Hey, Shannon, what did you see?" I don't say, "1 second, let me look at my sources. I'm going to recount what I saw." Right?
Well,
so
okay,
you're just admitting that they're not eyewitness they're not eyewitnesses, right?
Yeah, they're not.
The Gospels,
so
they're not.
So Luke was
cool. So how do we know that Jesus said anything that he said, or did anything
also,
that
they
he
claim
did?
to be.
Well, hold on.
And
they themselves claim.
Luke doesn't.
So yeah. I believe Matthew and Mark did.
First of all, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. What were you saying?
No, you're good.
It's like if you're I'm sorry. Go on.
Good.
Yeah. So first of all, you don't have to be an eyewitness to accurately. So these sources probably came from eyewitnesses. So Mark, we know
it's hearsay.
We believe Mark.
So it's hearsay, and you don't know the actual source. You just use the word probably. So that means you have no idea what the actual source was.
Okay.
You don't. Are you going to say something about the Q document or something?
I'm not. Well, I could, but okay. We know. So there's a very not very well-known Christian historian named Papias, and he lived in the early part of the second. He lived in the early part of the 2nd century, and he recorded that Mark was an interpreter of Peter. So Mark.
So he lived in the early part of the what century? When did Papias live?
He lived in the early part of the 2nd century.
Okay. When did Jesus die?
He was about. I'm trying to get there. Papias said that Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and this was about 100. He said this about 100 years after the lifetime of Jesus Christ, and that Matthew wrote. Matthew wrote down a bunch of sayings in Hebrew that were known at the time of Papias. So those sayings.
Then why were the Bible? Why was his gospel written in Koine Greek if he was writing down Hebrew sayings in Hebrew?
Because it was obviously because it was translated at some point and the original Hebrew was lost.
Obviously, because probably sources. Like you can hear a lot of the words that you're using, right, to describe this.
Yeah,
like,
that makes sense.
This is a story where you're saying if I posit all of these things, then I can get to the point that I can believe it's an accurate eyewitness account. But in order to get to the point that I can believe it's an accurate eyewitness account, that I have to say probably, maybe, referred to sources 200 years later, a guy who was in no place to know what was going on said that Peter who doesn't have a gospel. We have nothing from Peter, by the way. We have nothing from Peter. The only thing that we have that even references Peter is Paul, the Apostle Paul, going to visit Peter. And he doesn't even say what Peter said to him. All he says is he added nothing to my gospel. That's all we have. So we know Peter existed, and we know he was ahead of the church through historical documentation. We have absolutely nothing written from Peter. So you expect me to believe that your story makes sense from Papias 200 years later, or 100 and some years later. The Papias says Mark wrote it. Let me finish. The Papias said Mark was writing stuff down that Peter was telling him in Hebrew, but then the gospel was in Greek. And it's the most sparse gospel also, by the way. Mark is the most sparse gospel. That was written in Greek. I am not quite done. But that Paul, who wrote the most shit down, who was writing letters to everybody, had access to this shit that Mark was writing down and referenced it 0 times, it would ultimately end up becoming the Gospel of Mark. It would be the gospel. I am not done. It would be the Gospel of Mark one day. It was available because Peter had a scribe that was writing things down in Hebrew, and Paul went to visit him and had access to these Gospels and used them not one the fuck at all, referenced them 0% of the time, incorporated them into none of his letters. But I'm supposed to believe that because 100 and some years later, some guy who said that Mark was probably maybe a scribe that wrote some stuff down for Peter, that means that he wrote the Gospel of Mark and that it's Peter's firsthand account, even though it doesn't name him, it names Mark? No, thank you.
Mark, hold on. All right. Can
I'm done.
Go? First of all, when it comes to the Greek, you should know that about the year 400 A.D., Jerome, who was a church, father, whatever you want to call him, translated the Vulgate from the Hebrew. So he said this. So we know the Hebrew versions of these Gospels existed up until
so that
we know
400 years later that there were Hebrew versions of the Gospel.
Yes, we do, because Jerome was
our earliest versions. Like if you look at the fragments, you seem to know your stuff, right? If you look at the fragments, the earliest copies of the Gospels that we have, what language are they written in? The earliest copies of the Gospels that we have, what language are they written in?
They're in Greek, and there's a reason for that. Okay, I'm trying to explain to you, but you keep interrupting me.
Is the word probably, maybe, or 300 years later going to come up?
Explain to me how Jerome could be translating from the Hebrew if these got in the year 400, we know he lived in the year 400. If these documents didn't exist, how was he translating from them?
Because the tradition was circulating for hundreds of years at that point, and Christianity was becoming a well-followed movement, and there was all kinds of people that were writing down what they believed during that 300 and some year time span, probably in more languages than just Greek by that time. I'm saying the original documentation that we have that is contemporary is in Greek. And you're saying, well, 400 years later, there was Hebrew versions. So you're saying, why did they translate them into Greek?
They translated them to Greek because it was the universal language of that time. The Hebrew versions lasted at least up until the year 400 because Jerome made extensive commentaries on the Hebrew versions. They were lost sometime after that. So that's indisputable.
What does that have to do with anything? All that proves is that sometime between when the church was formed and 400 and several hundred years later, there was well-circulated copies of the gospel in Hebrew. That's literally the only thing you're proving right now.
Yes. So
and I agree.
The point is these things existed. There were people who knew Hebrew and they knew Greek, and they translated them. Jerome is one of them. He's one of the most famous people in the year 400. So
I don't think he's tracking what you're proving, Anthony. The contention is that yes, there were Hebrew versions. No, you have zero evidence that those are the original versions, whereas we have strong evidence that the original versions were in Greek. Okay.
But the point is, we know that they existed up to a certain time frame, and then they were lost. And I think
these particular translations in Hebrew, the fact that we lost translations in Hebrew still does not prove that they are the original translations. Even if we accepted every single thing you said at face value, it would not conclude in your conclusion. The fact that there were Hebrew translations, right, and the fact that at any point there was a translator that translated them back into Greek, or for the first time into Greek, does not prove that they are original. Right? You can go on and on and on about the same story, right? Adding more to the story, but even if we accept your story, your narrative, it does not actually end where you think it's ending. That's what we're pointing to.
Right.
So you need additional evidence.
Well,
Shannon's provided actual real evidence that is actually in reality, which is that the original the oldest fragments we have are in Greek. That would prove they're original, unless you can show previous ones in Hebrew, right? Or some reason that the Greek was translated in Hebrew, which you could do linguistic analysis on. And when linguists look at it, we see.
Anyway. Let's talk about the Septuagint and how there's misquotations in the Gospels that tell you that the authors were Greek because they mistranslate things that were mistranslated in the Septuagint verbatim into their Gospels, which means their reference material was the Greek Septuagint and not the Hebrew Bible, which means that they were Greek speakers.
Could be. Yeah, I don't dispute that.
Could be.
But the point
maybe.
the point
We
is,
have evidence and you don't. Like.
Well, hold on. I want to go back to why I want to try and go back to Papias, because he's a 2nd century historian, and he wrote lots and lots of stuff, and he was quoted by Eusebius. He was quoted by many very important figures who used his work.
Okay.
He tells us, and he might not be correct, but he tells us Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and Mark wrote the gospel, and that Matthew wrote down sayings in Hebrew, and that I'm guessing that these sayings got incorporated into whatever Mark wrote, and Mark wrote down what he heard. Matthew wrote down what he heard from Jesus. So he is an eyewitness, and what he wrote about what he heard Jesus say are the Sermon on the Mount and the parables and things like that. And we find very early Christians quoting these things, but they don't call them gospels. They call them memoirs of the apostles or things like that. But we do see this line of transmission from eyewitnesses so we can say that Jesus probably did exist and say these things. It's not 100%, but there are valid historical reasons to think that we do actually know some of what Jesus said.
Do you think either of us are arguing that Jesus' existence? I don't care.
No,
I legitimately don't care if he did or didn't exist. I think that the probability that there was an apocalyptic creature named Jesus roaming around at that specific point in time that garnered a following is, reasonable enough that I'm willing to just accept it on probability. Like, I don't care. I'm not a mythicist, because none of it actually matters to me. I don't believe that he resurrected. I don't believe that he was God. And I don't believe that the Gospels are firsthand accounts of his life and teaching.
Well,
I think that they are myth building.
Does something have to be firsthand to be true? Like, can someone not know George Washington directly, but gather information about him and put him in
the only reference you have to if the only reference you have to this person's existence and teachings and claims of divinity and witnessing of his divinity are 4 little books written 2,000 years ago, you would anticipate, and they were named by those people, then you would anticipate that you would want it to be firsthand accounts, not hearsay framed as a firsthand account where they're all copying each other. We haven't even started talking about the synoptic problem, where you can see the legend building take place. I know what the synoptic problem is.
I disagree.
Aware of what the synoptic problem is.
Mark wrote the gospel, the sayings of Matthew were added to it, and therefore, in Matthew, we do have a firsthand account of the words of Jesus. You asked me, how do we know what Jesus said? Or you said something along those lines. Well, there is actually a line of transmission that you can argue Papias was just making things up, but
so you're saying that they're not firsthand accounts then, right? So they're not firsthand accounts.
They are firsthand accounts according.
They are
to
firsthand
Papias.
accounts that copy each other almost verbatim.
They know.
That's what you're saying. You're saying it's totally okay.
Matthew,
I think he's misunderstanding what a firsthand account is.
Okay, well, Mark.
If there's a line of transmission, it's not a firsthand account. That's a secondhand account.
Saying
That's fine.
It's a recounting. It's somebody else saying,
true, though,
I heard.
Okay, if there's
it still could be true. Sure. It still could be true. Sure. But it lowers the probability that it's true. It's not good evidence. Listen to me for a second, Anthony. I need to hammer this point home. I'm swinging around this little stick. Listen to me for a second. We'll go back to the car accident analogy. So let's say that somebody says, Shannon saw a car accident. This is what she saw. Is that better? There's problems with firsthand accounts too, but we won't get into that. I don't think we have time. But if somebody says, Shannon saw a car accident and this is what she saw and told you, you have probably a reason to believe that maybe I did see a car accident, if you know the person, depending on the context, and maybe that is what I saw. But you hearing from that person is not as good as hearing from me, right? Because you can get firsthand information from me. The evidence of what I saw is better coming from me, correct?
Right. Okay.
So what you're saying, it could still be true. I will grant you that. It could still be true. It could be verbatim. They could have nailed it. But it's not as good. You'll admit that, right? It's not as good. Lowers the probability. Lowers the probability of accuracy. It actually does it pretty drastically psychologically. If you read a lot of Elizabeth Loftus' work, you just should.
I mean, that's your opinion. Each person will have to decide.
It's not my opinion. It is scientific fact. First-hand accounts corrode almost immediately because our memories aren't great. And once we start to recount them, we start to kind of rebuild our memories in our mind as well. So what I actually witnessed I can be primed. Like there's a really famous study that Elizabeth Loftus did. It's one of the best ones. You should go look at that if nothing else. She showed people a car accident, a wide variety of people a car accident, the same car accident. Everybody saw the same car accident. And she asked them all one question with one word difference in each question. One group was asked, how fast was the car going when it bumped into the other car? The next group was asked, how fast was the car going when it smashed into the other car? And the last one was asked, how fast was the car going when it like collided or something that was neutral? The ones that had the leading language, smash versus bump, all vastly overestimated the speed the car was going, even though they all watched the same thing that the other group did. Like it was many standard deviations difference in the disparity and what people were recounting of their own firsthand account. And when they started to tell that story to other people, they exaggerated, potentially even more when they were recounting, because they were building that memory as they were recounting.
Okay.
So
there was a car
that
accident,
is that is how things get corroded over time. So what you're saying to me is that in order to adopt what you're subscribing to, I have to believe that they were the firsthand accounts of people, 4 separate firsthand accounts. They copied each other, but there's a reason they copied each other that has to do with chain of custody of these accounts, because they aren't actually.
No, they weren't copying each other.
They were not copying each other verbatim. Matthew copied Mark verbatim.
Let me explain it to you.
All had the same
including
idea.
how he met Jesus. Verbatim.
Let me explain it to you again, because you got this.
I don't need you to explain it to me.
One more. Let me try one more time. Based on the historical record we have, Mark wrote the gospel. He wrote the framework of the gospel.
We don't have a historical record that Mark wrote the gospel.
Yes, we do. It's Papias said exactly that. He said Mark was the interpreter of Peter.
You said that Papias said that Mark was writing down some Hebrew phrases for Peter. That's what he said.
No. Listen again, because you're getting it wrong. This is what Papias said. It's in fragment 6. Mm-hmm. There are 10 fragments we have of what Papias said. It's all in fragment 6. Papias said that Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and that he wrote the gospel based on what he heard Peter saying as they were evangelizing. That's what Papias said in the early 100s AD. Papias also said that Matthew wrote down sayings he heard from Jesus in Hebrew. So my theory of what happened is that no one copied each other. Mark wrote the gospel, and then somehow at some point, I doubt it was Matthew himself, what he wrote down got added to Mark's gospel as the sayings of Jesus, and it all became like the gospel of Matthew, even though Mark wrote the original. So yeah, I guess you could call it.
Let me read you something from a biblical scholar on Papias. It is interesting that Papias tells a story that is recorded in our Matthew, but tells it so completely differently that it appears he doesn't know Matthew's version. And so when he says Matthew wrote Matthew, is he referring to our Matthew or some other book?
No,
Recall that the gospel he refers to is the collect. This is from Bart Ehrman. I was like, I'm just going to go look up so that I'm not just taking, okay, so you're presenting what your subjective version of this is, but it seems to me that there's some contention amongst the scholars that what you're saying is something that's generally accepted.
No, this is what
Because it
Papias
sounds like
will
when
actually-
Papias is talking about Matthew, what he's talking about is completely inconsistent in what we see in Matthew in a multitude of ways.
Yes, that's true.
So-
yeah, that's true. So
Okay.
yeah, I agree. But the
Right.
hold on.
It's true.
Here's
But that's your
what you're missing.
reference.
Here's
Your
what you're
reference
missing.
is Papias saying that, no, I'm not missing anything. You just got called out. You are saying,
No,
I'm not listening or I'm not understanding. And I'm telling you that I'm
There-
reading what Bart Ehrman wrote about this specific topic, who I trust more than you because he's actually a well-known
Okay.
scholar on this topic. And what he's saying, you affirm, which is that what Papias tells about Matthew and writes about what Matthew says is so incongruent with the Gospel of Matthew that it doesn't even seem like he's familiar with the Gospel of Matthew. It's so different. And you're saying, well, yeah,
Right.
but that means that it is a firsthand account, or at least some
Yeah,
chain of
so,
custody of a firsthand
there-
account. So by the time it got
It
to
is a
Papias, it was
firsthand-
so corrupted. How did we get our version? That was the version is Papias's version corrupted, or is it the one in the Bible? Which one?
The sayings
Should I
of
start to read? Should we put Papias's version
Yeah,
of Matthew in the
okay.
Bible, since that's
Okay.
your reference
This is what
for
I'm
why Matthew wrote Matthew and that it's firsthand account? Because they shouldn't be different at all.
Hold on. Let me answer. So yes, you are correct. The gospel of this is why I was talking about inerrancy. If you hold to inerrancy, I can't go this route. But once you give up inerrancy, yes, Matthew did not write the version of Matthew that we have now. It's very different from what
And Papias's
saw.
firsthand account that you're referencing that says it's evidence for that Matthew still is a firsthand account is also different from Matthew. So you're going to have to get rid of that apologetic that that's evidence that it's a firsthand account, because what Matthew he's referencing is so vastly different that it's not even recognizable as the Gospel of Matthew according to the scholarship.
If you all right, you're going to have to think
So that
about
apologetic
this maybe later.
gone. Okay, call back.
Fine. Yeah,
I'll do
but
some
it was
reading. You
based
do some
on-
reading,
Yeah,
and we'll talk later.
yeah. I don't.
We
I
have
don't
hit
care
time.
what those people. Okay, well, you're wrong. There is firsthand account.
Okay, well,
what
I
Jesus
just
said.
read you what Bart Ehrman said, and you agreed with me. But
It is
sure,
contained
you can
it
think
is
I'm wrong.
contained in the New Testament. It is. Well, let me at least try to wrap some of this up. Matthew did write a number of sayings down as a firsthand witness. It was not in the original.
and we know that because who told us? Is the answer
because
Papias?
Okay, so
Because Papias said
Papias.
Matthew said
So-
what? Matthew said what? Papias? What Matthew said? Papias?
Now
Matthew
you're
said
getting
what?
Now you're getting emotional. Now you don't want.
I'm not emotional. I think it's fucking
You're getting-
hysterical, actually.
Plastic.
You're getting refuted. This is information that a lot of people don't know, but
A lot of
yes,
people
we-
don't
we
know
have
that Papias
reliable-
said Matthew said stuff that is completely different than what Matthew said in the Gospels.
Okay,
A lot of people don't know that. I'm glad that we could have this conversation today.
You could cast doubt on any historical figure using your hermeneutic. And that's what you're
We
doing.
don't doubt that he's a historical figure.
Papias,
I don't think
Papias
say
said
Papias
that-
doesn't exist. I said that his
well, you're-
version
you're
of Matthew, the one that you're referencing as being
So what?
justification for saying that the version of Matthew that's in the Gospels is a firsthand account. You're saying we look at Papias and Papias
No, I
referenced
never-
Matthew.
I
Then we
never
look at what
said-
Papias says Matthew said, and it does not match what's in the Bible. So that's not good evidence for you. And you're
You're not really
refusing to
listening to me.
acknowledge. And you
You are
agreed with
not
me. You're like,
listening
yeah,
to
no,
me.
they are different. I am listening to you.
You're not. I agreed with you.
You're
The
not listening to
version
me.
of Matthew
You're not listening to
has-
me. I've been trying to tell you.
No, all right, just acknowledge what I'm saying. The version of Matthew have
I
is
did.
not the original.
I think
Is
I understand
not
quite well.
what Matthew originally wrote. Do you understand that?
The version that
Understand
Papias had isn't what Matthew originally wrote. Gotcha. It's
No, I'm
completely
saying
different.
no, that was not my question. That was not my question. My question is this: the version of Matthew we have now is not what Papias saw. Agreed?
They're different. Uh-huh.
Okay, yes. Okay, yes.
Yep.
We can both agree on that. But Matthew did write things down as a first witness, sayings of Jesus. He doesn't say what those sayings are, but we can probably conclude that some of those sayings ended up in the gospel.
We
not in
can
the current
probably conclude that
presentation.
based on what? Based on what? What are we concluding that
Well,
based on? The fact we really
well-
want it to be true? The fact that Papias said Matthew wrote stuff down and what Papias said Matthew wrote down in no way has any sort of resemblance to what Matthew wrote down in the Bible. So we can just probably infer that therefore the stuff that says Matthew in the Bible was also written by the person that's unrecognizable as Matthew in the Bible because fucking reasons, I guess. No, thank you.
Papias's evidence would actually run counter to that, right? The fact that Papias shows a huge set of things that are drastically different than Matthew said, doesn't that seem to run contrary to the idea that Matthew said what he said in the Bible? Like the exact evidence you're trying to bring up completely refutes the assumption that you're attempting to sneak.
I think the problem you're having is that I think the current version.
The problem you're having is that I was reading while you were talking, and I found out some stuff.
Interrupted me.
No. We don't. Once again, if you repeat inerrancy, like I don't know how we're gonna have. Like I don't know what you're talking about. No one thinks you think the Bible's perfect. You made that very, very clear. It didn't matter because no one on this call takes inerrancy into question. We're doing basic historical analysis and seeing what evidence points to where. The evidence you've brought up, even if we accepted what Papias said at face value, once again, none of us historical scholars, I don't really care, does not support what you're saying because you're trying to sneak in the premise that the current Matthew at all resembles what the original Matthew said by pointing to what Papias said, which is that it was a first-hand account, but the first-hand account that Papias provides is in contradiction with the exact assumption you're trying to sneak without any evidence. No. So the only evidence you've brought contradicts what you're saying, and the assumption you want us to accept has no evidence except for the contrary evidence that you brought.
The current version of Matthew, this is what I believe, the current version of Matthew is not what Matthew wrote. So it was not written by Matthew. The name Matthew, was just historical tradition that was attributed to it. The current version of Matthew was compiled by anonymous early Christians, but it contains sayings from Matthew.
That's who.
And we know this, or we can logically deduce this from the fact that Papias said that there were sayings of Matthew, and these.
And he provided the sayings, and they weren't those. That's the most important part. Papias provided the sayings, and they weren't those.
He just said Matthew existed. No, okay, look, we're going in circles, Anthony. Anthony, we're going in circles. We're done. I'm calling it. I need wine. We're done. Well, thank you. Please call back again. Right. We've already gone over time. No more. I let you keep going after the last time you said, let me tie this up. If we keep going, we're going to go forever and ever and ever. Call back. We'll chat again. I enjoyed it. I love talking about like Bible stuff, especially New Testament stuff. In my house, that's all we talk about. So I hope you have a lovely evening, and thank you, Anthony. Have a good night. Bye.
Hello, I'm Jimmy Snow, executive producer of The Line, and I only became a woodworker for the puns. That's not important. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so on our Patreon or as a channel member, and you can actually support specific shows and specific hosts in special tiers on those. Check those options out. Also, you can leave a super thanks and get a little highlighted deal. But if all else fails, you can always you can subscribe and leave a comment. Now, here are some suggestions because I don't care about the algorithm. I am the algorithm. Bye.